The scorching sun of northern Mexico cast long shadows across the barren landscape as Alma Dayer LeBaron surveyed the desolate terrain that would become his kingdom. It was the autumn of 1924, and the dust still clung to his weathered boots from the long journey south from Utah. The acrid smell of sage and creosote filled his nostrils as he breathed in the dry desert air, a stark contrast to the green valleys he had left behind. Behind him, a caravan of 7 wagons stretched across the rocky ground, their wooden wheels creaking under the weight of everything the LeBaron family owned. 43 souls in total had made this treacherous journey. 3 wives, 18 children ranging from infants to young adults, and 22 followers who had chosen exile over submission to what they saw as a corrupted church. "This is where God wants us," Alma declared to his eldest son, Joel, who stood beside him with skeptical eyes, scanning the endless expanse of nothing. The boy was only 14, but the harsh realities of their exile had aged him beyond his years. His face, already weathered by sun and hardship, bore the serious expression of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Father, there's nothing here," Joel replied, his voice carrying a note of concern that he tried to keep respectful. "No water, no shelter, no way to grow food. How will we survive?" Alma's eyes blazed with the fervor that had first attracted followers to him years ago in Utah. But now, that same intensity carried an edge of desperation that made even his own children uncomfortable. "The Lord provides for the faithful, my son." Abraham was called to leave his homeland and trust in God's promises. Moses led the children of Israel into the wilderness. We are following in their footsteps. The wind howled across the empty desert, carrying with it the promise of isolation that Alma craved. No government officials would venture this far into the wasteland. No church authorities would question his interpretation of divine will. No neighbors would report on the activities of his growing family. Here, in this God-forsaken corner of Mexico, the LeBaron family would be free to follow what Alma believed was the original path to salvation. Sarah, his first wife and the mother of his oldest children, approached cautiously from the lead wagon. At 38, she had borne him 7 children and had watched with growing unease as her husband's religious convictions had hardened into something that frightened her. Her face, once beautiful, was now drawn with exhaustion and worry, her hands rough from years of hard work and constant childbearing. "Alma, the children are hungry and we have little water left," she said, her voice carefully modulated to avoid triggering his anger. "Little Mary has been crying for hours, and the baby needs feeding. Are you certain this is where we should settle?" Alma turned to face his wife, and for a moment Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. It was a look of absolute certainty, mixed with something darker, a hunger that seemed to go beyond mere religious conviction. "The Lord has revealed this place to me in vision, Sarah. I have seen what we will build here. A city of God that will stand as a beacon to the faithful. We will create something pure, something untainted by the compromises and corruptions of the outside world." As the family began to unload their meager belongings, the reality of their situation became starkly apparent. They had enough food for perhaps 2 weeks, water for less than that, and winter was approaching. The nearest town was 3 days' ride through treacherous terrain, and they had no guarantee of finding supplies even there. But Alma seemed oblivious to these practical concerns. His mind was already working on grander plans, visions of a community that would operate according to his interpretation of divine law. As he watched his wives and children struggle with heavy boxes and furniture, he saw not the immediate hardships, but the future glory that awaited them. "Gather around," he called out as the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red. "We must establish the order of our new community from the very beginning." The family and their followers formed a circle around Alma, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a hastily built campfire. The desert night was already growing cold, and several of the younger children pressed close to their mothers for warmth. "We are no longer bound by the laws of men," Alma announced, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no dissent. "The government that cast us out, the church that rejected us, they have no power here. We answer only to God, and God has chosen me to be his voice among you." Rebecca, Sarah's 15-year-old daughter, shifted uncomfortably as her stepfather's eyes lingered on her developing form. There was something in his gaze that made her skin crawl, though she couldn't yet understand why. She had noticed this look before, during the long journey south, but had dismissed it as her imagination. "The principle of plural marriage is sacred," Alma continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "But it is more than that. It is the key to exaltation, the path to becoming gods ourselves. Here, we will practice it as it was meant to be practiced, without the weak compromises of those who lack faith." Martha, his second wife, nodded in agreement, though her expression was troubled. She had married Alma when she was 17, believing in his vision of spiritual perfection. Now, at 29, she was beginning to question whether that vision had been corrupted by something more earthly. "The blood of our family is special," Alma declared, his voice rising with passion. "We carry within us the pure lineage of the prophets. This blood must not be diluted by mixing with those who lack our spiritual heritage. Our marriages, our children, our very existence must serve to preserve and strengthen this sacred inheritance." As he spoke, Alma's gaze moved from face to face, cataloging each person according to their potential usefulness in his grand design. The teenage girls received particular attention, their futures already being planned in his mind. The boys would become his lieutenants, the girls would become mothers to a new generation of believers. "Here in this wilderness," he continued, "we will build something that has never existed before, a community where God's true will can be practiced without interference, where the pure doctrine can flourish without corruption, where the faithful can achieve the exaltation that has been promised to them." As the meeting dispersed and families began to settle in for their first night in the desert, the vast emptiness around them seemed to press in like a living thing. The stars overhead, brilliant in the clear desert air, looked down on a group of people who had willingly cut themselves off from civilization in pursuit of a dream that was already beginning to twist into something darker. Sarah lay awake in the wagon that served as her temporary home, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying an almost human quality that made her shiver. Beside her, her youngest children slept fitfully, their small bodies pressed against hers for warmth and comfort. Through the thin canvas covering of the wagon, she could see Alma's silhouette as he sat by the dying fire, his mind clearly working on the plans that would transform this barren land into his vision of paradise. But as Sarah watched her husband's dark form against the starlit sky, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. She had followed him this far out of duty and faith, believing in his promises of spiritual freedom and divine purpose. But as she looked at her children sleeping fitfully on the hard wagon bed, she began to wonder if they had not fled from persecution, but rather into something far worse. The isolation that Alma saw as liberation was beginning to feel like imprisonment. The religious freedom he promised was starting to look like a different kind of bondage. And the pure doctrine he claimed to preserve was already showing signs of corruption that would only grow worse with time. In the distance, the wind carried the sound of shifting sand and the rustle of desert creatures going about their nocturnal business. But to Sarah's ears, it sounded almost like whispers, voices warning of the darkness that was about to descend on her family and all who followed them into this God-forsaken wilderness. The LeBaron colony was about to be born, and with it a legacy of darkness that would span generations and leave a trail of broken lives in its wake. 6 months had passed since the LeBaron family's arrival in the Mexican desert, and what had once been empty wasteland now showed the unmistakable signs of permanent settlement. Adobe buildings rose from the earth like monuments to Alma's unwavering will, their thick walls providing shelter from both the scorching heat of summer days and the bitter cold of desert nights. The transformation had not come easily. 3 members of their original group had died during the harsh winter months, 2 infants who succumbed to pneumonia, and an elderly follower whose heart had given out during the backbreaking work of construction. Their graves, marked by simple wooden crosses, served as grim reminders of the price of Alma's vision. But for every life lost, 2 more seemed to arrive. Word of Alma's pure doctrine had spread through underground networks of disaffected Mormons, carried by travelers and traders who moved between the scattered communities of the American Southwest. A steady trickle of believers had made the dangerous journey south, each bringing with them stories of persecution and a desperate hunger for the spiritual freedom that Alma promised. The colony now housed 67 souls, and Alma ruled over them with the absolute authority of a prophet. There were no outside laws here, no government officials to question his methods, no church hierarchy to challenge his revelations. Only his word, which he claimed came directly from God through visions and divine inspiration. Thomas Widtsoe had been among the most recent arrivals, bringing with him his wife Mary and their 2 young daughters, Elizabeth and Ruth. A skilled carpenter from Arizona, Thomas had fled his home after local authorities had begun investigating reports of plural marriage in his community. He had heard of Alma's colony through whispered conversations in Mormon settlements, and had seen it as a refuge where he could practice his faith without fear. "Brother Alma," Thomas called out as he approached the largest adobe structure, which served as both meeting house and Alma's residence. "The well is nearly complete. We should have fresh water within the week." Alma nodded approvingly as he surveyed the growing settlement from the doorway of his home. The main building was an impressive structure by desert standards, with thick walls that kept the interior cool during the day and warm at night. It contained not only the meeting hall where the community gathered for worship, but also Alma's private quarters, which had grown increasingly elaborate as his sense of his own importance had expanded. "Excellent work, Brother Thomas," Alma replied, his voice carrying the tone of a benevolent ruler addressing a faithful subject. "The Lord blesses those who labor in his vineyard. Your efforts will not go unrewarded in this life or the next." The promise of reward was not idle flattery. Alma had developed an intricate system of spiritual hierarchy within the colony, with positions of authority and privilege distributed according to loyalty, usefulness, and blood relationship to the prophet himself. Those who pleased him found their circumstances improved, while those who questioned his authority discovered that life in the desert could become very difficult indeed. In the largest adobe structure, the evening gathering was about to begin. These nightly sessions had become the cornerstone of colony life, where Alma would deliver revelations, settle disputes, and establish the rules that governed their isolated community. Attendance was mandatory for all members over the age of 8, and absence without permission was considered a sign of spiritual weakness that required correction. The interior of the meeting hall was lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Wooden benches, crafted by Thomas Widtsoe and other skilled workers, provided seating for the growing congregation. At the front of the room, Alma's chair sat elevated on a small platform, symbolizing his position as the earthly representative of divine authority. "My dear brothers and sisters," Alma began as the last stragglers found their seats, his voice echoing off the adobe walls with practiced authority. "Tonight the Lord has revealed to me a new understanding of his divine plan for our people, a revelation that will guide us toward the exaltation that awaits the faithful. Rebecca LeBaron, now 16 and increasingly uncomfortable under her stepfather's frequent stares, sat with her mother Sarah in the front row. The months in the desert had changed her from a girl into a young woman, and she had begun to notice the way certain men in the colony looked at her. But it was Alma's gaze that troubled her most, carrying as it did an intensity that seemed to go beyond paternal interest. Behind them, the other families arranged themselves according to the hierarchy that Alma had established. His wives and children occupied the places of honor, followed by the families who had been with him the longest, then the more recent arrivals. At the back of the hall sat those who had somehow fallen from favor, their reduced status visible to all. The principle of celestial marriage, Alma continued, his eyes scanning the assembled faces with the calculating gaze of a predator selecting prey, is not merely about taking multiple wives. It is about creating eternal bonds that transcend the temporary laws of earthly governments. But there is more, much more, that the Lord requires of us. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Alma paused dramatically. He had been building toward this moment for weeks, carefully preparing his followers through a series of increasingly radical sermons that had gradually shifted their understanding of acceptable behavior. "The blood of our family is sacred," he declared, his voice rising with passion. "We are the chosen lineage, set apart to preserve the pure doctrine in these last days. To maintain this sacred bloodline, the Lord has commanded that we must be selective in how we form our eternal unions." Sarah felt her stomach clench as she began to understand the direction of her husband's revelation. She had seen the signs building for months, the way he looked at the young girls in the colony, the questions he asked about their development, the private conversations he held with their fathers about spiritual worthiness and eternal rewards. "Young women of our colony," Alma continued, his gaze settling on the teenage girls present like a physical weight. "You are not to be given to outsiders who might dilute the sacred blood. Your marriages must be arranged within the family to preserve the purity that God has blessed us with." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath as the implications of Alma's words sank in. Several fathers shifted uncomfortably, their protective instincts warring with their faith in the man they had followed into the wilderness. "Furthermore," Alma added, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "the Lord has shown me that spiritual maturity comes earlier to those of pure blood. Our daughters are ready for celestial marriage at 14, sometimes younger, if the Spirit so directs." Thomas Whitsoe felt his blood run cold as he processed what he was hearing. His daughters, Elizabeth and Ruth, were only 12 and 10 respectively, but he could see the calculating look in Alma's eyes as they settled on his family. The promise of spiritual reward suddenly seemed less appealing when weighed against the safety of his children. "This is the new covenant," Alma announced, raising his hands as if in blessing, though the gesture felt more like a curse to many who witnessed it. "Through these sacred unions, we will create a generation of spiritual giants, children born of pure blood and divine purpose. This is how we achieve salvation. Not through the weak compromises of the outside world, but through absolute obedience to God's true will." Martha, Alma's second wife, sat frozen in her seat as she listened to her husband's words. She had married him believing in his vision of spiritual perfection, but this revelation struck her as something fundamentally wrong. The thought of her own daughters, still children, being subjected to what Alma was describing filled her with a horror she struggled to conceal. "The marriages will be arranged according to revelation," Alma continued, his voice taking on the tone of absolute authority. "I will receive divine guidance about which unions will best serve the Lord's purposes. No marriage will take place without my approval, and no young woman will be given to a man outside our sacred bloodline." As he spoke, Alma's gaze moved systematically through the congregation, mentally cataloguing each family according to their potential usefulness in his grand design. The teenage girls received particular attention, their futures already being planned in his mind. Rebecca, his stepdaughter, would be given to one of his sons to strengthen the family bonds. Elizabeth Whitsoe, despite her father's obvious discomfort, would make an excellent wife for another of his boys when she reached the proper age. "The Lord has also revealed," Alma added, his voice carrying a note of warning, "that those who resist these sacred arrangements are in danger of losing their eternal salvation. The natural man is an enemy to God, and natural affections must be subordinated to divine will." The threat was clear, though couched in religious language. Those who opposed Alma's plans would face not only earthly consequences, but eternal damnation. In a community where spiritual authority was absolute and physical escape was nearly impossible, the weight of such a threat was enormous. Dr. James Morrison, a physician who had arrived at the colony just 2 months earlier, felt his medical training rebel against what he was hearing. The idea of girls barely past childhood being forced into marriage violated everything he understood about human development and psychological health. But he was new to the community, dependent on Alma's goodwill for his family's survival and acutely aware of his vulnerable position. As the meeting dispersed, families walked back to their homes in stunned silence. The desert night, once a symbol of freedom from outside interference, now felt oppressive and confining. The walls that protected them from the outside world had become the bars of a prison, and Alma LeBaron held the only key. In her small room, Rebecca lay awake, listening to the hushed, urgent whispers of her mother and stepfather in the next room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Her fate was being decided without her consent, and there was nowhere to run in the vast emptiness that surrounded them. "She's too young," she heard her mother say, the words carrying clearly through the thin adobe walls. "The Lord's timing is not our timing," came Alma's reply, his voice carrying the finality of divine decree. "Rebecca is spiritually mature beyond her years. The marriage will strengthen our family bonds and ensure her place in the celestial kingdom." "But she's just a child," Sarah protested, her voice breaking with emotion. "She should have time to grow, to learn, to choose her own path." "Choice is an illusion, Sarah. We are all instruments in the Lord's hands, and our personal desires must be subordinated to His greater plan. Rebecca will be grateful for this blessing when she understands its eternal significance." The conversation continued in whispers too low for Rebecca to hear, but she had heard enough. Her stepfather was planning to marry her off to one of his sons, and her mother's protests were falling on deaf ears. The realization filled her with a terror that went beyond mere fear. It was the horror of understanding that her life was no longer her own. In other homes throughout the colony, similar conversations were taking place. Parents who had come to the desert seeking religious freedom found themselves trapped in a system that demanded the sacrifice of their children's innocence on the altar of Alma's twisted interpretation of divine will. Thomas Whitsoe sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, as he contemplated the impossible choice before him. He could submit to Alma's authority and watch his daughters be given in marriage to men old enough to be their fathers, or he could resist and face the consequences of defying a prophet who claimed to speak for God. "What are we going to do?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness of their small room. "I don't know," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with despair. "We came here seeking freedom, but we've walked into a trap, and now our children are going to pay the price for our mistake." The foundation of the LeBaron colony's dark future had been laid with Alma's revelation about sacred bloodlines and arranged marriages. What had begun as a refuge for religious freedom was transforming into something far more sinister, a place where divine revelation served as justification for the darkest of human impulses. The first cracks in the facade of religious devotion were beginning to show, but the isolation of the desert and the absolute nature of Alma's authority made resistance seem impossible. The colony was becoming a closed system where power flowed in only one direction, and where the word of the prophet was law, regardless of its moral implications. As the desert wind howled around the adobe walls of the settlement, it carried with it the sound of muffled sobs from homes where parents contemplated the fate of their children. The LeBaron family's descent into darkness had begun in earnest, and there seemed to be no force capable of stopping its inexorable progress toward horror. The seeds of a dynasty built on abuse and fanaticism had been planted in the fertile soil of religious extremism, and they would grow to cast a shadow over generations yet unborn. The summer of 1925 brought with it a heat that seemed to emanate not just from the merciless sun, but from the very soul of the LeBaron colony. What had begun as a refuge for religious freedom had transformed into something far more sinister, a place where divine revelation served as justification for the darkest of human impulses. Rebecca LeBaron stood before the cracked mirror in her small room, her hands trembling as she adjusted the white dress that had been laid out for her. At 17, she was considered past due for marriage by the colony's new standards, and today marked the culmination of months of careful manipulation by her stepfather. "The Lord has revealed to me your eternal companion," Alma had announced to her just 3 days prior, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that made her skin crawl. "You are to be sealed to Brother Ervil, my son, in a union that will strengthen the sacred bloodline and ensure your place in the celestial kingdom." Ervil LeBaron, Alma's 22-year-old son from his second wife, had grown into a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. The prospect of marrying his stepsister had filled him with a dark satisfaction that went far beyond religious duty. In the main meeting house, the colony had gathered for what Alma called a sacred sealing ceremony. The ritual bore little resemblance to traditional Mormon weddings, having been twisted by Alma's increasingly bizarre revelations into something that served his growing appetite for control over every aspect of his followers' lives. Sarah LeBaron sat in the front row, her face a mask of resigned despair. She had tried to protest her daughter's fate, but Alma's response had been swift and brutal. A woman who questioned the prophet's revelations he had declared was in danger of losing her eternal salvation. The threat had been enough to silence her, though it could not ease the guilt that gnawed at her heart. "Dearly beloved," Alma began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "we gather today to witness a sacred covenant, one that transcends the temporary bonds of earthly marriage and creates an eternal union blessed by the Almighty himself." The assembled colonists watched in uncomfortable silence as Rebecca was led to the makeshift altar. Many of them had harbored doubts about the direction their community was taking, but the isolation of the desert and their complete dependence on Alma's leadership had made resistance seem impossible. "Brother Ervil," Alma continued, placing his hand on his son's shoulder, "do you take Sister Rebecca as your eternal companion, to be bound to you not just in this life, but in all the eternities to come, according to the sacred principle of celestial marriage as revealed to me by the Lord?" Ervil's response was immediate and filled with a hunger that made several witnesses shift uncomfortably. "I do, Father. I accept this sacred responsibility and the blessings that come with it." When it came time for Rebecca to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. The words of consent were extracted from her like a confession under torture, each syllable a betrayal of her own will and dignity. As the ceremony concluded, Alma raised his hands in a gesture of blessing that felt more like a curse. "By the authority of the holy priesthood and the revelations given to me as prophet of this people, I pronounce you husband and wife for time and all eternity. What God has joined together through his chosen servant, let no man put asunder. The celebration that followed was a grotesque parody of joy. The colonists went through the motions of festivity, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken horror. Children who had once played freely now watched their parents with fearful eyes, understanding instinctively that their own futures hung in the balance of Alma's increasingly twisted revelations. That night, as Rebecca was led to the small adobe house that would serve as her prison, other families in the colony held whispered conversations about escape, but the desert that surrounded them was vast and unforgiving, and Alma had made it clear that those who attempted to leave would be considered apostates, cut off from both the community and their eternal salvation. Thomas Whitsoe found himself staring at his two daughters as they slept, their innocent faces illuminated by moonlight streaming through the small window. At 12 and 10, they were rapidly approaching the age that Alma considered suitable for marriage, and Thomas knew with growing certainty that his own sons would soon be considered appropriate husbands for them. The covenant that Alma had established was not one of love or even religious devotion, but of flesh and power. The sacred bloodline he claimed to protect was being corrupted by his own twisted desires, and the salvation he promised was beginning to look suspiciously like damnation. As the desert wind howled around the adobe walls of the colony, it carried with it the sound of muffled sobs from the newlyweds' house. The LeBaron family's descent into darkness had reached a new depth, and there seemed to be no bottom to the abyss that Alma was creating in the name of God. The seeds of a dynasty built on abuse and fanaticism had been planted, and they would grow to cast a shadow over generations yet unborn. By the winter of 1927, the LeBaron colony had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to its original inhabitants. What had begun as a small settlement of religious refugees had grown into a complex hierarchy of power and abuse, with Alma LeBaron sitting at its apex like a spider at the center of an ever-expanding web. The colony now housed over 100 souls, drawn by promises of spiritual freedom, but trapped by a system of control that extended into every aspect of their lives. New adobe buildings stretched across the desert landscape, their walls hiding secrets that would have horrified the outside world if the outside world had known they existed. In his private study, Alma reviewed the carefully maintained records that documented his growing empire. Each family was catalogued not just by name and number, but by their usefulness to his grand design. Young girls were tracked from birth, their futures predetermined by their bloodline and their potential value in the complex web of marriages that Alma orchestrated with the precision of a chess master. Father Ervil LeBaron entered the room without knocking, a privilege afforded only to Alma's most trusted sons. At 24, he had become his father's chief enforcer, the one who ensured that dissent was quickly and quietly eliminated. The Whitsoe family is causing problems again. Alma looked up from his records, his eyes cold and calculating. Thomas Whitsoe had been a thorn in his side for months, ever since the man had begun questioning the increasingly young age of the girls being given in marriage. His daughters, now 14 and 12, had been promised to 2 of Alma's sons, but Thomas had been resistant to the arrangements. "What kind of problems?" Alma asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "He's been talking to other families, spreading doubt about our revelations. Yesterday, I caught him trying to convince the Johnsons to leave with him. He claims he's received his own revelation that this place is cursed." Alma's laugh was devoid of humor. Thomas Whitsoe has forgotten that revelation comes only through the proper channels. Perhaps it's time he was reminded of his place in the eternal order. The reminder came that very evening during the colony's weekly testimony meeting. As the community gathered in the main hall, Alma rose to address what he called a cancer in our midst. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, "the Lord has revealed to me that there are those among us who have allowed Satan to whisper doubts into their hearts. These doubts, if left unchecked, will destroy not only their own salvation, but the salvation of their families." Thomas Whitsoe felt every eye in the room turn toward him, and he knew that his moment of reckoning had arrived. Beside him, his wife Mary clutched their daughters closer, her face pale with fear. "Brother Thomas," Alma continued, his gaze boring into the man like a physical force, "you have been heard speaking against the revelations that God has given to his chosen prophet. You have questioned the sacred marriages that bind our community together in eternal bonds. Do you deny these accusations?" The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas looked around at the faces of people he had once considered friends and saw only fear and condemnation. The isolation of the desert had done its work well. There was no higher authority to appeal to, no outside help to call upon. I have had concerns," Thomas admitted, his voice barely audible. "Some of the girls are so young, and the marriages within families, it doesn't feel right." Alma's response was swift and merciless. "What feels right to the natural man is often an abomination to God. Your concerns are not revelations, Brother Thomas. They are temptations sent by the adversary to destroy the work of the Lord." The prophet's voice rose to fill the hall, his words carrying the power of absolute conviction. "The sacred principle of celestial marriage, as practiced in our community, is the key to exaltation. Those who reject it reject their own salvation. Those who speak against it speak against God himself." As Alma continued his denunciation, Rebecca LeBaron sat in the back of the hall, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. At 19, she was pregnant with her second child. Both conceived through unions that had been forced upon her in the name of divine will. The light had long since died in her eyes, replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose spirit had been systematically broken. "The punishment for apostasy," Alma declared, his voice reaching a crescendo, "is excommunication from this holy community and eternal damnation in the world to come. But the Lord is merciful, and he offers Brother Thomas one final chance at redemption." The terms of that redemption were as cruel as they were calculated. Thomas would publicly confess his sins and reaffirm his faith in Alma's revelations. His daughters would be immediately sealed to their promised husbands, and he would serve a period of penance during which his family would be under constant surveillance. As Thomas knelt before the assembled community and spoke the words that sealed his daughter's fate, the desert wind outside seemed to carry with it the sound of weeping. The LeBaron colony had become a place where salvation was purchased with the innocence of children, and where the word of God was twisted to serve the darkest desires of men. The empire that Alma had built was thriving, fed by a steady diet of fear, isolation, and the perversion of sacred principles. And at its heart sat a man who had convinced himself that his sins were sanctified, that his crimes were commandments, and that his damnation was actually salvation. The worst was yet to come. The year 1930 marked a turning point in the history of the LeBaron colony, though not in the way that Alma had envisioned. What he had built as a monument to his divine authority was beginning to crack under the weight of its own corruption, and the seeds of violence that he had planted were finally beginning to bear their bitter fruit. The colony now sprawled across several square miles of desert, its population having swelled to nearly 300 souls. But growth had brought new challenges, and Alma's iron grip on power was being tested by forces both within and without his carefully constructed kingdom. In the pre-dawn darkness of a cold February morning, a group of men gathered in secret at the edge of the settlement. Led by Thomas Whitsoe, who had never truly accepted his forced submission 3 years earlier, they represented the growing resistance to Alma's increasingly tyrannical rule. "We can't continue to let this happen," Thomas whispered urgently to the dozen men who had risked everything to attend this clandestine meeting. "My daughters, what he's done to them, what he's planning for the younger girls. It has to stop." Among the conspirators was Dr. James Morrison, a physician who had arrived at the colony the previous year seeking religious freedom, but had instead found himself witness to horrors that violated every oath he had taken. The medical examinations he had been forced to conduct on young brides had shown him the true extent of the abuse that Alma's revelations had sanctioned. "I've documented everything," Morrison said, producing a leather journal from beneath his coat. "The injuries, the pregnancies in girls barely past childhood, the psychological trauma. If we can get this information to the authorities—" "Oh, what authorities?" interrupted Samuel Peterson, another long-time resident whose own son had been forced into marriage with his 13-year-old cousin. "We're in the middle of nowhere, in a foreign country. Alma has made sure that no one knows we exist and no one cares what happens here." The truth of Peterson's words hung heavy in the cold air. The isolation that had once seemed like protection had become their prison, and Alma's careful cultivation of relationships with local Mexican officials had ensured that the colony operated with complete impunity. But even as the resistance planned their desperate gambit, Alma was consolidating his power in ways that would make escape even more difficult. In his private chambers, he met with his most trusted sons to discuss what he called the final revelation. "The Lord has shown me the ultimate purpose of our community," Alma announced to Ervil, Joel, and his other adult sons. "We are not merely to preserve the pure doctrine, we are to spread it. The time has come to establish new colonies, to extend our influence beyond this single settlement." Ervil's eyes gleamed with anticipation. At 27, he had grown into a man whose appetite for power and control rivaled his father's. "Where would we establish these new settlements, Father?" "The Lord has revealed several locations," Alma replied, unrolling a hand-drawn map across his desk. "Utah, Arizona, even back into Mexico. Each colony will be led by one of my sons, but all will answer to the central authority here. We will create a network of communities, all bound together by the sacred principles we have established." The plan was ambitious and terrifying in its scope. Alma envisioned a dynasty that would span generations, with the LeBaron name becoming synonymous with a twisted form of religious authority that recognized no law but his own interpretation of divine will. But as the conspirators had learned, even the best-laid plans could be undone by human frailty and the weight of accumulated sin. The resistance movement that Thomas Widtsoe had started was growing, fed by the desperation of parents who could no longer bear to watch their children suffer. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Alma's network of informants had infiltrated the resistance from the beginning, and when the conspirators finally moved to act, they found themselves surrounded by armed men loyal to the prophet. "Did you really think you could move against the Lord's anointed without consequence?" Alma asked, as the captured conspirators were dragged before him in the main hall. The entire colony had been assembled to witness what he called the judgment of apostates. Thomas Widtsoe, his face bloodied from the struggle, looked up at the man who had destroyed so many lives in the name of God. "You're not a prophet," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You're a monster who uses religion to justify his crimes." Alma's response was to signal to Ervil, who stepped forward with a pistol in his hand. The shot that followed echoed across the desert like thunder, and Thomas Widtsoe's body crumpled to the floor of the hall where he had once worshipped. "Let this be a lesson to all who would raise their hand against the Lord's chosen," Alma declared, as the colonists stared in horror at the spreading pool of blood. "The penalty for apostasy is death, both temporal and eternal." The murder of Thomas Widtsoe marked the point of no return for the LeBaron colony. What had begun as religious extremism had crossed the line into outright criminality, and the man who claimed to speak for God had revealed himself to be nothing more than a killer who would stop at nothing to maintain his power. In the years that followed, the colony would indeed expand as Alma had envisioned, spreading its poison across the American Southwest and into other parts of Mexico. The LeBaron name would become associated with a legacy of violence, abuse, and fanaticism that would span generations. But on that cold February morning in 1930, as Thomas Witzow's blood soaked into the earthen floor of the meeting hall, the true nature of Alma's salvation was finally revealed. The pact he had made was not with God, but with something far darker, and the price of that bargain would be paid in the suffering of countless innocents for decades to come. The horrific sexual pact of the LeBaron family had claimed its first official victim, but it would not be the last. The empire of sin that Alma had built would continue to grow, fed by the twisted belief that salvation could be achieved through the very acts that damned the soul. And in the vast emptiness of the Mexican desert, the wind continued to blow, carrying with it the echoes of crimes that would never be fully answered for, and the cries of victims whose voices would never be heard by the outside world. The darkness had taken root, and it would flourish for generations.